become a drinking buddy with an attorney, buy them the occasional beer, and over a beer try to get free legal advice from them. Sometimes we see through it, but sometimes we don't. But that way you're having the ongoing conversation.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Amplify Your Business. Today, I have a very special guest. This is a guy who's been doing some really exciting things on both sides of the border, but he is currently down in the U.S. Welcome to the show, Doug. Really appreciate you taking the time today. Before I get into the questions, though, I want to give everybody a quick intro as to who you are and what you've been doing. So, Doug McCullough's legal journey has been marked by a strong entrepreneurial spirit. He founded and managed his own law firm for 8 years, gaining firsthand experience and insights into the challenges and rewards of running a business. This experience informs his approach as he works with clients, helping them navigate the legal landscape with a practical understanding of their needs. In his current role as partner at Crady, Jewett, McCullough, and Huron LLP, Doug regularly represents entrepreneurs at various stages of their business journey. His expertise in corporate transactions and tax law allows him to provide valuable guidance on structuring deals that are both effective and efficient. With a Master of Law in Taxation from Southern Methodist University, he is well equipped to handle the intricacies of mergers and acquisitions. In addition to his legal practice, Doug is actively involved in fostering business relationships. He has played a key role in the Canada-Texas Chamber of Commerce, where he serves as a director. This organization aims to enhance trade and investment between Canada and Texas, reflecting Doug's commitment to connecting businesses across borders. Doug's passion for connecting people extends into supporting those just entering their careers. He founded Texas Young Professionals to support emerging leaders in the community, demonstrating his dedication to nurturing the next generation of entrepreneurs. Doug McCullough's blend of legal expertise and entrepreneurial experience makes him a valuable resource for those looking to navigate the complexities of business law. Whether you're starting a new venture or considering an exit strategy, Doug's insights can help guide you on your journey. Welcome to the show, Doug.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have you here because this is one of those rare opportunities where we have somebody who has just a wealth of experience in entrepreneurs, in working with entrepreneurs, but then also working with businesses on both sides of the border. So most of my guests are usually firmly planted in one or the other, and so you bring a really unique experience. So I really appreciate you taking the time today to sit with us and talk to us a little bit about some of the things that we need to understand as businesses if we are looking at doing cross-border business. And so that's one of the questions I guess I'd like to really start out with. But before I really get into that question, what would you say are some of the common pitfalls that you find other entrepreneurs, whether those are people that you've worked with, that you've served, or possibly even from your own experience being an entrepreneur? What are some common pitfalls that entrepreneurs fall into oftentimes?
Yeah, I think one thing that I see, and I think that even I could say that I've sort of experienced in my own life, is when you're first starting out, is that hesitation where you go through school and it's very much about the permission to go. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go up this chain, and I'm going to you stage things, and then you graduate to the next level. As an employee, you sort of wait for permission. You get promoted, and you have to go through this process. And I think that sometimes that hurdle for entrepreneurs, sometimes the budding entrepreneurs, is waiting for who is it that's supposed to give me permission. And really kind of getting over that mental block that actually that's sort of the liberating experience of being an entrepreneur, is saying, I'm going to go do this. I don't, yes, I'm going to make some sacrifices, but I don't have to have somebody give me permission to do this or tell me, how to do it. It's part of the, it's part of what being an entrepreneur means in terms of it's an undertaking, it's an adventure. And I think that's one thing that's sort of early stage is maybe it's not so much a pitfall for the entrepreneurs. Maybe it's what keeps people from being an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
But another thing that I see quite a bit, and particularly on the legal side, we run into this all the time. Is it's really what I just sort of described is often that solo entrepreneur. They're the one driving force. Maybe they pull some people together with them, but there's sort of one person that's doing everything, and they have to get over that hurdle to make the decision, sort of go no go decision. But the next pitfall that we see quite a bit is you have a group of 2 or 3 people that have started a business together, and a lot of times it's sort of like you get your it's almost like a band. You get all the different players that you think are necessary, and you're sort of making this up, imagining what's necessary. But what often happens is you go to your friends, and there's nothing wrong per se with doing business with your friends. But one of the things that we see so often is there's sort of expectations that are maybe they're unstated. And what ultimately happens is you find out if you've got a startup team of 3 people, it's often 2 people that are the driving force, and there's that one other person who's still a little bit along for the ride. And one of the pitfalls we see is if you don't deal with that, in a really forthright way, you can sort of creep along for a while, pulling along that person. But if they don't know their role and they're allowed to sort of become frustrated and not pull their weight, you may be giving away equity to somebody who's not producing, and ultimately it's rare that doesn't end in acrimony where we get the phone call as attorneys like, how do we move on? How do we move on from this old friend of ours that's not producing? And we just, I definitely encourage people at an early stages, just be really upfront with what everybody's role is and how you amicably part ways.
Yeah, that whole what do you call it? Unanimous shareholders agreement, right? That's such a critical thing to have in place in partnerships, right? With that exit clause, whatever that exit clause is going to be. Any advice in terms of some of the ones that you've seen that seem to work really well for that exit? And I know that's a generalization really that I'm asking for, because every business, every partnership is probably quite unique. But is there some commonalities there in terms of best practice?
Yeah, I think that one thing that there's some that are, and it really depends on the nature of the business, because in some situations, particularly if someone's putting in capital, that's one scenario where you have an investor. You can't really just say, well, we no longer are getting along with you, we can buy you out on the cheap. Like, they put in capital, so there's a whole different proposition there. But in some situations, particularly if it's more sweat equity, somebody's putting in effort, and then they're given equity as opposed to vesting in equity over time. That's where you start to have a problem. If, like, the idea was we just sort of expected you to produce and you don't, then there better be some type of right of redemption on behalf of the company, which is to say, we set out the terms of, like, if a majority decides to part ways, that there's a fair and equitable way to value what the value of their interest is, and to and buy them out at that point. Or just more of and you certainly see this in companies that are playing in the angel investor and VC space, is a true vesting schedule where somebody is, we don't just give them equity, but they have to earn it over time, hit milestones, hit a certain amount of periods of time that they've been there. And those are sort of tried and true.
Yeah. So, you've worked with a lot of different businesses. And so I'm just wondering also if you have any advice on, some of the things that entrepreneurs often overlook, whether that's from, the business management side or your expertise in the legal side. What do you often see there as well, besides, what we just talked about, is those proper exit clauses and
those are definitely some big ones. And I think that, what I would, and this may sound self-serving, but I would definitely say, get an attorney that you have a relationship with. I mean, what I would actually say as advice is become a drinking buddy with an attorney. Buy them the occasional beer, and over a beer, try to get free legal advice from them. Sometimes we see through it, but sometimes we don't. but but that way you're having the ongoing conversation. And one of the things I've told clients over the years is I would much rather have a 5-minute conversation with you that I don't bill you for, where you tell me about a problem that you see coming on the horizon, and then I tell you, oh, just don't do XYZ, and then the problem goes away, versus suddenly we're trying to, I'm probably arguing myself out of a lot of legal fees, but it's like I'd rather you not go pay my partner for litigation. I would rather let's keep the company growing so that we can ultimately raise capital and sell the company. So tell me when you think you might have a problem, and then maybe there's actually a really simple solution. But it's sometimes that being, at least when it comes to dealing with professionals, is being sort of penny wise and pound foolish, of like, just have the quick phone call with somebody, with an attorney, and maybe they'll steer you in the right direction and you won't have a major problem.
Yeah, yeah, kind of heading things off before they really blow up,
Absolutely.
probably
Yeah.
too, right? Like I mean, we see this in all aspects of business, in my experience. Whether it's like on the HR side, where something's coming up, there's some animosity that's happening, or poor performance or whatever by an employee, as an example, and so if you just let it fester and turn into something bigger, it definitely turns into something bigger. But if you can kind of nip it in the bud before it becomes something. And so your advice is, hey, if you get enough spidey senses, if you're starting to feel like maybe there's something coming up here from a legal standpoint, have a conversation with a lawyer so that you can get ahead of it, right?
Yeah, and another thing I'd say too is, in addition to a lawyer and a CPA, definitely build out a small peer group of people that you can just call and say, hey, what do you
Yeah.
think of this? And I can think of a situation that's kind of happening right now where it's an entrepreneur friend of mine that is, someone is requesting equity, and so the question is, on what terms? So we appreciate what you've done, but is that in the category of this is a grant of equity? And so you have to go through those questions, and also a good reason to have board members or an attorney is you don't always want to be the bad guy,
Yeah.
and you want to be able to say, I ran it by my counsel, I ran it by my board, we can't do that. So that you're not always, sometimes it's nice to have a fall guy, if you will. I think for a lot of reasons, I think it's really good to have that peer group. And I know that, here in the United States, and it may have Vistage as well in Canada, I know there's large organizations where you can pay to be part of these peer groups. But I think that sometimes just organically, um, you know, companies that are early stage may not have the benefit of peers at the country club, so to speak, where much more mature companies have that, where you can have that
Yeah.
peer-to-peer relationship. But I think finding those business peer-to-peer type of conversations, I think, are helpful just to know. I mean, it's helpful in a lot of ways. Like how are you dealing with potential investors? How are you dealing with key employees that want equity and things like this, and sort of hearing the best, the best practices that are out there, at least what's happening out there locally, right? Because I mean, every market is a little bit different.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and your advice applies right across the board. This is something that we hear commonly amongst a lot of our guests, is just surrounding yourself with great advisors. Now, whether those are paid advisors like legal counsel, or whether they're board members, or you have non-paid people that are just part of a good network of other entrepreneurs and business people who have gone through the things that you're trying to go through now, right? It's having that advice, and so definitely counsel is one of the key ones in that. So now, in terms of, I teased at the beginning that I'm really excited to talk to you about the cross-border nature, and so of your practice
Mm-hmm.
and your expertise. And so you're down in Texas. I'm in Alberta, up here in Canada, which we call the Texas of the North in a lot of respect, because the economies are quite similar, oil and gas and agriculture and so on. So when it comes to the work that you're doing with businesses trying to help, I'd like to spin it around this way. So help Canadian companies basically get into the U.S. marketplace. What are some of the common, pitfalls or challenges that businesses face there that they really need to understand? Because we're talking two different jurisdictions, two different
Mm-hmm.
cultures, two different ways of doing business. Everything can be quite different, even though we are really close neighbors, right?
Right. Yeah, I would say the good news is the legal system is pretty similar in the sense of, somebody who's savvy about, Canadian business law, whether they're in IT or they're in energy, they can pick up a contract in Texas, and it's going to look familiar to them. It's going to be spelled differently, but it's going to look pretty similar concepts. So that part's good. And I would say this, like, we wouldn't even say that about our next door neighbor in Louisiana, which you probably have sort of a similar experience with Quebec, because those, that in Quebec or Louisiana, they're based on civil law versus, in most of Canada, most of the United States, and Texas, were based on common law. So the concepts are really similar. So that's the good news. I guess one of the, again, sort of almost self-serving of, you really have to make sure that you're talking with an attorney when you're ready to actually move in and form a company in the United States. Talk with a U.S. attorney that actually understands Canadian companies operating in the United States. And the reason I say that is, one of the most common forms of companies in the United States is a limited liability company. It's great if you're an American. It's disregarded, which means it's not taxed as its own entity, but the owners are taxed. So in that sense, it's like a partnership, but you could have a single member LLC, so that one person is basically taxed as if it's a sole proprietorship on their personal tax return, but they have limited liability protection. The problem is it doesn't really work very well for Canadians. The reason is that Revenue Canada doesn't recognize the limited liability company as a separate corporation, and it creates all sorts of timing issues. It creates problems with the foreign tax credits. It creates problems with the income tax treaty not applying. So one of the things that we run into every once in a while is we'll find a company that's already started. Maybe they've been in the United States for a year or two, and they've set up that LLC, and we have to quickly tell them, like, hey, right before you start actually making a profit, let's get this fixed. Let's get you in a corporation or a partnership, because it can create some unexpected tax problems. But those are the types of things that, even if you're talking with the U.S. attorney, if they don't know that fact pattern, they may not know that. But that's one of the things that we definitely run into quite a bit. But like I said, on balance, the good news is the legal concepts are the same. And if you're coming from practically anywhere in Canada and you move into Texas in particular, it's going to be a much more employer-friendly state. Now, I'm not going to say that about California. It's probably going to be very comparable in terms of being pretty employee-friendly.
Yeah, definitely. We have a different system in place up here for that. Yeah, it definitely is weighted more in the favor of the employee in a lot of circumstances, for sure. So, a question for you, because you do a lot of mergers and acquisitions. When you counsel somebody who's thinking about expanding into the U.S., do you naturally take that conversation into trying to determine, does it make sense to start up a subsidiary, like another arm of the business in the U.S., or does it make more sense to maybe acquire or merge with a company on the U.S. side? What kind of counsel would you give to somebody who's asking that question?
Yeah, I mean, it really truly depends on their situation, and part of it is a financial calculation. But ultimately, the question is there already a market for your particular product and service? Is it something that you can easily import into the United States? Then that may be a situation where you just want to set up a subsidiary, do what you've done in Canada, and just sort of repeat that. But in lots of businesses, what would happen is you have something that's branded well in Canada that may not really be known locally in a particular state. And so at that point, what you may want to do is to think about an acquisition, even if it's sort of buying a small company just to have a toehold. And then, like, what you're doing is, you always ask the questions of, and apart from sort of the financial side of things, you're always asking the question, like, what's the purpose of the acquisition? Are you acquiring a technology? That may be a situation, or are you acquiring basically a customer base, or the employees? And I think a lot of times, if you're looking at, say, a lower middle market company or even an SME that's making an acquisition from Canada or elsewhere into the United States, it may not be that technology play. It may just be like, hey, we've done it well in our home country. We've done it well in Canada, but we don't have really any significant customer base. We don't really have any, we don't really know the market, and we could immediately have a manufacturing facility or whatever you need to have. You could have immediately have developers, whatever you need locally. We can sort of in one move acquire all that, and then, whether you immediately rebrand that U.S. company under the Canadian name, you can be transitioning into, okay, this is a Canadian company operating here, and then you can have a little bit more rapid growth, hopefully. The downside is it's going to cost more, but it probably will actually get you to greater market share more rapidly.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. And so I'm curious, when you're talking to U.S. companies who are looking to expand into Canada, um, do you have different types of advice that you're providing to them? Then is that a different conversation that you're having?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the industry they're in. I mean, obviously, sitting here in Texas, a lot of those conversations are in the energy space,
Yep,
and when that happens, they're most likely talking about Alberta.
yep,
There may be some that are going to be more natural gas, going to be like British Columbia or what have you. But and then other industries, they're certainly going to be interested in expanding into Ontario if we're having a very large market there. So really, I think it really depends on what the industry that they're in, and then you kind of go through the same analysis as like if you have let's just say you've got a Texas company and you've been able to reach into the markets in, say, Boston and New York, then you probably can almost do the same type of approach in Toronto, but in the sense of you are going into a new legal system, you're going to a whole new banking system and all that. So there's going to be some differences. But if you were able to sort of just simply sell into those markets, like in the Northeast of the United States, you probably can do something similar in Canada. But if you go through that analysis and say, we really just don't have any market presence, we don't have the facilities, we don't have the employees, we don't have the customers, that's when, maybe that's when it makes sense to say, hey, we just want to do it. We want to do an acquisition so that we can grow much more rapidly. And then other times it's that geography is not even the factor at all, and that's really when it's more of a technology play. Like that company, they just simply have a really great technology. It's going to play worldwide, and we don't really care where they're at.
yep, yeah. And in terms of your practice, do you work mostly with companies in Canada trying to penetrate the Texas market, or vice versa?
It's definitely more southbound right now,
It
and I
is.
think it's been that way for a while. Now I think some of that is, Texans like to or tend to be a little bit braggadocious, and so we like that. We tend to really like it when particular, like say, California companies come to Texas. We really, we take real joy in that. But
I,
we
I,
do,
I
we
can
do
think of one big one that did
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah,
There's some high profile ones that lately, and we definitely get a rise out of every time that happens. But we definitely see a lot of Canadian companies expand. Sometimes they're an outright move, but a lot of times they're just an expansion where it's like, they're not shutting down in Canada, but they see a bigger market in the United States.
yeah,
And the reality is, um, the U.S. market's much larger than Canada, but the Canadian market's roughly the same size as Texas. It's almost spot on. I think that if Texas were its own country, as some of us think we should be, that it would be the eighth largest market in the world. And I think Canada currently is the ninth. So it's like they really are almost identical size markets. So in that sense, even just expanding from Canada into Texas is basically doubling the market.
yeah. So now, in terms of us Canadians up here, we kind of have an eye on what's happening in the U.S. from a political standpoint, just simply because we get a lot of our news, and as the old adage goes, if the U.S. catches a cough in terms of economic situation, we catch a cold because we are so reliant on that trade
Right.
relationship. So we do always keep a bit of an eye on things down there. In the Do you counsel them on the geopolitical changes that are happening a bit? And I mean, who knows what's going to happen in the upcoming election, but There's lots of challenges there, I would imagine, that directly impact a lot of business, especially when we're talking about the energy sector, right? And
Right.
policies can shift so quickly there.
Yeah, no, we have those conversations, and I tend to be pretty blunt. And through my role for the Canada Texas Chamber, we have some pretty blunt conversations with some Canadian officials, both at the provincial level and the federal level. And I won't share those conversations, but they're pretty blunt, because what they want is they want information, and it's the same with clients. We'll have a pretty frank conversation with them, not for the sake of being political or partisan, but just like, this is what you need to know for your business. And um, you know, one area that is pretty, that there's at least a potential swing is tax. But we already have the tax, the prior tax bill or tax law is set to expire if nothing happens. And so one of the things that we have to be sort of, transparent about is, like, right now we have some really favorable tax rates, and that is, it's law that's going to go away, and the rates are going to be going higher unless we have a scenario where one particular party wins across the board. Because
Yep.
we're not a parliamentary system. For let's just say the Republicans win the House, the Senate, and the White House. Well, then you probably be looking at extending those tax cuts. But if you don't check every one of those three boxes, it's most likely that nothing changes to the tax law. But by the same token, if you say that the Democrats sweep and win the House, the Senate, and the White House, well, there's going to be a real temptation to raise taxes, and there's some unusual, um, little crazy ideas out there, like taxing unrealized capital gains and such, that I joke with my CPA friends, it would be great for them, because I can't even imagine the number of hours they'd have to spend on it trying to get their heads around it. I think that the clients absolutely want us to sort of not necessarily make a prediction, but sort of give them say, here are the range of possibilities of what may happen based on who wins both the White House, the Senate, the Congress, and what are the ways this plays out. And then, sort of on the regulatory side, maybe on tariffs. Again, tariffs would be a big one that,
Yep.
you might look at this as a Canadian company and say, we're thinking about expanding in the United States. And on one hand, if there is a Republican wave, maybe there's going to be lower taxes for us. But on the flip side, if you're looking at it and saying, if the Republicans win, we may be in for more tariffs, and that's not going to be helpful on the any Canadian imports in the U.S. market. So it's, you just have to be really, you can't sort of think through a partisan lens. You have to really sort of think through what the effects might be. And it's really, you mentioned in oil and gas, it really depends on the industry.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And this is one of the things that we don't experience a lot in Canada. I mean, sure, we do have some policy changes that happen, but in general, our governments tend to stick around a lot longer. We don't have the flipping back and forth between where you guys tend to, every 8 years, it feels like there's a change in government, and therefore then a change in some policies and whatnot, where ours are a little bit more stable. And so Canadian businesses just don't have to navigate through the complexities of that nearly as much. That's why I wanted to ask you. Now, just turning your, I guess, your focus a little bit more back to your entrepreneurial journey, and the things that you've learned along the way, and things that maybe, challenges that you had to overcome as you were growing your business, or again, maybe as you see other businesses trying to grow theirs. What would you say would be something that, knowing what you know now, if you were to be starting a new
Mm.
business, tomorrow, regardless of what the industry it's in, what would you take into that new business now, in terms of knowledge and the things that you would do, that maybe would be a little different than the way that it was when you first started your first firm?
Yeah, I think that, and maybe kind of what I led with in the first place was sort of like that feeling of, you almost need somebody to endorse what you're doing, and that feeling
Yeah.
of, like, you almost like need permission. I definitely think that I wish that I had started, being more entrepreneurial at a younger age, as an attorney. And I'll say this, as a in the legal profession, there really is a benefit to mentorship and working under somebody who's you know learned the process, how to manage a business, become a really good professional, but also learn the business of it. There's really almost no substitute for sort of getting mentored that way,
Mm.
for a number of years. But I definitely feel like I sort of it was in my mind, or something that I wanted to do, but I think I just kind of like when is the right time? When do I see some sign that I can do this?
But at the same time, there's so many lessons that come along with the tenure that you have in any type of role, right? And so it definitely would have an impact. It's so hard to predict what the impact would be on the business.
Yeah. And I think one other thing, and I think this is very true of lawyers and other sort of white collar professionals, but I've seen it in other areas too, is embracing sales.
Mm.
It's almost feels like a dirty word, particularly us lawyers. We're in a profession, like we're not salespeople. Like, no, you are. We're all in sales and business development, and it's not a dirty word. And I had a long-term relationship with a restaurant group here in Houston, and I remember having a conversation with the founder and saying, you need to have almost a cult of personality of like let people know your story, because he did have a really interesting story, and like let people know the story, let them see your personality, and that personality can sell. It's going to be part of the brand of the entire restaurant group. And I
Yeah.
think that as a lawyer, you have to sort of embrace that. And I think it's true of a lot of, and I think there's probably an analogy with, because I've had clients that have had this where they feel like they're really like a developer, and I've come up with this really elegant design for the software. Like, is there a market for it?
Yeah.
Have you done anything to either identify the market or create the market? Because you're not going to make any revenue unless somebody goes and sells, and until you hire a team, like you've got to be convincing. You got to sell people that's the product.
Yeah, yeah, and that leads me to one of the one of the new trends right now in terms of marketing that there's a lot of talk about, and that is personality marketing. And so, really driven by this user generated content influencer side of things now, which is becoming a bigger and bigger element of most marketing. Initiatives that companies are running. And so one of the thoughts right now is just that with the way that AI is coming on strong in terms of content creation and in terms of even a lot of the product development is all getting these layers of AI added to them, but it's the same kind of wrapper, AI wrapper that's on it. So things are going to start to look a lot more similar all the time. And so the marketing as well is going to look very similar, sound very similar, because of so much AI being used within it. And so, how do you stand out? How do you really position yourself within that crowded space? Especially when you think about how more crowded it's going to get because of the volume of content that's going to get created with AI. And so, one of the things that people are saying is that it's going to be much more reliant on personality. So if you can find that personality within the brand, whether that's the owner, whether that's something that you hire in, whether that is aligning yourself with a spokesperson, an influencer, whatever the case might be, a brand advocate, having the personality is going to be very important in terms of really capturing and holding on to people's attention.
Yeah, and there might be even a little bit of tension there. Hadn't thought about this until this moment, but one of the things that every branding person I've ever talked to is branding is all about consistency. You've got to define your brand and then be really consistent with it. But this whole idea of personality is like, if you're going to hold people's attention, you've got to I'm not saying be flawed, but you got to be a little quirky and a little bit unexpected at times, right? I mean, if you're doing the same thing over and over again, it's stale. But if you do something that's, I don't want to say out of character, but slightly surprising, then that's attention grabbing.
Yeah, yeah, or this stands out within the industry in which you're in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the challenge, I think, for a lot of businesses, is to really try to figure out, okay, so how do I do that without alienating a certain class or group of potential customers, but still build that tribe of people who really like the personality that you're building for this. And I'd imagine the legal profession, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too. You guys have so many more restrictions in terms of
Mhm.
what you can and cannot say, and so on, from a marketing perspective. And so just the nature of the regulations, it's going to kind of hamstring a lot of you, I would think.
Yeah, I think to a certain degree. I mean, it used and I think there used to just be real, in addition to the actual written guidelines about what we could do for marketing, there used to be just sort of unwritten rules, unwritten code. And I hate to even say the attorney's name, but there's an attorney here in town who's, let's just say that he has the benefit of playing a lot of word games with his last name,
Okay.
and that may be a body part. And it's just like there, some of it is maybe you kind of induce a chuckle every once in a while, but it's like, we're selling legal services, and at a certain point, like this is kind of unseemly. But I
Yeah.
don't know. I'm a little bit old school.
Yeah. 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 And who knows, right? I mean, it can work for some people, and then others it doesn't. And
Right.
so it's a specific, I think, to the brand, to the person, to the industry, to the product or
Right.
service that
For
one is
sure.
selling. Yeah. Personalized, or sorry, marketing with personality is definitely an interesting journey. And I think we're going to see a tremendous amount of failures along the path as well, where it's
Right.
just like, what was that person thinking, right? Yeah.
Well,
So
I think in the entrepreneurial space, there's an expression about fail early, meaning don't waste a lot of time on time or capital on something. If you're going to fail early. I think also, if you're going to fail quietly. You don't want a big public failure, because you make some giant announcement, and it's what was it, like Segway years ago, that it was going to be the next big thing. It's like, it's okay.
yeah, yeah, totally. So let's wrap this interview up with some advice for the entrepreneurs who are listening, who are thinking about potentially exiting, or maybe they're in the earlier stages of their business. What should they maybe think about now in the earlier stages in terms of that exit strategy, so that they can exit successfully, right? So that they aren't leaving money on the table, so they can do it right. So how would you coach somebody on that?
Yeah, I would say, I don't want to say something as trite as it's never too early to be thinking about an exit, but I would say
Yeah,
you want to definitely think about it for a while. Financial planners will tell you that you should be thinking about it in terms of figuring out what you actually need for retirement, and I'm not going to discount that either. But I think you want to start thinking about it at an early stage, partly to get you want to have your house in order, because through when you start to actually go to market and sell your company, you're going to probably work with an investment banker. They're going to help you get ready for due diligence, and the buyer's always going to come through in a very standardized process, and they're going to look in every nook and cranny. They're going to find out everything about your business, and so you don't want to be putting the house in order right when you're trying to be dealing with buyers. You want to have
yeah,
everything pretty much under control. You want to have your taxes paid. You don't want to be taking aggressive positions on tax. You don't want to have a bunch of lawsuits. So sort of keep your nose clean and plan long term of like, this is what we want to do. We want to grow the company, but also there's real power in no. And
mm,
so, take it as a compliment the first time either a buyer comes and and says that they're interested in speaking with you. But more likely, what's going to happen is you're going to start getting hounded by investment bankers. And I have a love-hate relationship with investment bankers. Have the conversation with them, but don't sign the engagement letter until you really feel like they're the right team for you. And if you think it's too early, it's probably too early, and
mm,
let them convince you that no, now's the peak market and your company is absolutely ready. But talk to multiple at once, because what I tell clients, particularly if they come to me before they've signed up with an investment banker, I tell them, once you sign up with an investment banker, you are now inventory.
mm,
Don't mean to be rude towards investment bankers, but that's the reality. If they, once they sign the engagement letter, they have exclusivity, and they're not necessarily losing money if they don't make the sale. But if that investment banker isn't going through the right process to make the sale, then you're just sitting there, and now you seem like damaged goods if the sale doesn't happen rapidly, or if you go to market once and then you pull yourself back from the market. So you really want to make sure that the timing is right, that everything in your house is in order, that you have a good investment bank if you're using an investment banker, and most of the time it's right to use one. But if you're using an investment banker, don't go with the first one that calls you. Don't go with the unsolicited business broker. Really vet out the investment banker, because you could fire me as the attorney. I mean, why would you? But you could, and the same with the CPA. But once you sign that engagement letter with the investment banker, you pretty much have something like maybe a 2-year relationship with them. And if they don't get the job done, now you've wasted 2 years, a lot of time, probably some monthly fees, but also, again, there's that perception you're damaged goods. So just be really careful about doing it. And what I would say is that's where you need to have those peer conversations with, I'm an M&A attorney. I think now is always a great time to do a deal. The investment banker is always going to try to get you signed up as inventory, but talk to your peers. Find out what their process was like. Find out, what would ask them the questions you're asking me. What would you have done differently? And then talk to your CPA too. Like, well, let's find out how would you really value this company? Because even you don't necessarily you could go to a professional valuation firm, but you could go to a CPA and they can give you a back of the napkin number to say this is what we think the company's worth. And if you see something that's dramatically different than that, like dramatically lower, then just no is powerful.
Yep. Yeah, good advice. And so when I've talked to other people more on the financial side of things, when they start talking about, okay, so you're thinking about exiting, you should probably be looking at really optimizing your financial situation 5 years out, like start working on it. I mean, so that you are in the right, situation. You've got your systems all dialed in, you've got your structure, you've got the right people in place. The business can operate with you without you, as the founder. And then in terms of the legal side of things, what I'm hearing is maybe you really got to look at 2 years out.
I think that's about right. I think it's appropriate to be thinking, thinking about the exit from a very early stage. And I don't literally mean from day one, but from a very early stage, think about it. Know it's out there and learn the process. But you don't have to be, you don't have to be ready to do a 90-day sprint to the finish line, when you're 3 years in. You just need to kind of know what the process is going to ultimately look like, and ask questions of people, ask questions of professionals, ask questions of peers. Constantly find out more about the market, read the financial news, see what's going on, see what the multiples are. And sometimes, you may just see like, oh, here's an opportunity. Yeah. So that's, just gather a lot of information over time.
Yep. Wise. Okay. Well, I think that's a wrap. So if anybody wanted to connect with you, Doug, personally, to reach out to you about any of the things that we've been talking about, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Well, I'm easy to find on LinkedIn as Doug McCullough. Also, our law firm website is cjmhlaw.com. I'm easy to find either place.
Yeah, and we'll have those links in the show notes. So for those of you who are listening, just head over there, and you'll be able to click through from there. Thank you very much, Doug. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise, your time, guiding some entrepreneurs, giving them some things to think about as they are navigating through their journeys on their entrepreneurial adventures, let's say. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for those of you who are listening today, if you really enjoyed this episode and want to check out the rest of the archives, head over to amplifyyourbusiness.ca. That's where you're going to find all of our past episodes and obviously all our future ones as well. And if you're watching and you prefer to be listening, you can find us by just searching Amplify Your Business on your favorite podcasting platform. Until next time, everybody have a prosperous day.